Hello, I'd like to talk about a video titled Your Playtime Doesn't Matter, Stop Talking About It by Lucid, formerly Letters. My first reaction was, there's no way that's true, but the aggressive framing made me expect some serious substance behind the attitude, so I decided to hear it out. Meet Game Enjoyer. Here is a green nerd emoji representing the opposite of Lucid's position. The idea being that if Lucid shows that the inverse of his position is wrong, then he will automatically prove himself correct. This is called proof by contradiction, and in theory it's not only valid but also quite useful. You can put a lot of work into proving that X never happens, but it only takes one case of X to disprove your claim. Showing absurdity is often easier than positive proof. Game Enjoyer believes that people with a large playtime are always correct because they have a lot of hours. This shortens to playtime is the only thing that matters, because nothing else needs to be considered. Now, since I disagree with Lucid, that surely makes me a game enjoyer, right? Well, no. There are more positions you can hold on this issue than these two. You could present them as a spectrum. On one end would be playtime doesn't matter, then it only matters a bit, it's kind of important, it's very significant, all the way to playtime is the only thing that matters. This spectrum would, however, still be a simplification, because it can't really represent an answer like it depends. For example, if you said playtime matters more in competitive games, you would need an additional axis to represent competitiveness and then somehow graph the relationship between competitiveness and playtime mattering. The more factors your answer depends on, the harder it will be to come up with a theory that takes all of them into account. The point is, this is a complex issue with plenty of nuance to explore, but the video acts like you either believe that playtime doesn't matter or that big number makes you automatically correct. The only opposition Lucid gives himself is Game Enjoyer, which means that people who pushed past the abrasive stop talking and no one cares to hear the arguments in good faith are immediately greeted with a clown labelled "This is you," which I think is a questionable choice. Since the setup was supposed to be proof by contradiction, the points made within the video focus on taking down Game Enjoyer, which means none of them actually support playtime not mattering. On top of that, one of the points contradicts the premise by arguing that it's better to have less playtime, ergo that it matters just in the opposite direction. For that reason, instead of going point by point, I'll present my own take on the place of playtime and experience in video game discussions, and mention the original video where I find it relevant. To begin, playtime is a statistical metric, loosely correlated with investment, experience, and knowledge. Lucid argues that the number doesn't tell the whole story, as everyone learns at a different rate, and the number could even be faked. Granted, the number of hours played is by no means a precise representation. There will be outliers for whom it is woefully inaccurate. However, I pose that within those outliers, you are still more likely to find veterans being ignorant than experienced and knowledgeable people with 0 hours. This is because learning takes time, and while you can gain knowledge without playing the game, digging deeper is usually motivated by investment, and invested people are more likely to be playing the game. What playtime loses in precision, it makes up for in ease of use and universality. Playtime is very easy to post, especially compared to sharing your full history with the game. This compactness makes it a good starting point when explaining your perspective, while in no way preventing more details from being added later. Additionally, everyone has a reference for what an hour is, and gaming platforms like Steam automatically collect and show in-game time on your profile. By comparison, if you used a test score instead, it would be difficult to collect the data, your sample would only include the people that took the test, and the meaning of the score would be less relatable and intuitive. The number of hours is also easy to compare and group into ranges. Lucid argues that directly comparing unemployment counters is a silly way to settle arguments, which I think is a valid point, but while there's not much difference between 900 and 1000 hours, if you instead compare a player with 1 hour to a player with 1000 hours, you will almost always find a significant difference in perspective. You might be wondering why that difference in perspective would matter. After all, as Lucid argues, an opinion is right or wrong regardless of the author's experience or any other traits. Well, often the correctness of an opinion is much easier claimed than actually measured. The original video posits that opinions should be judged on their merit alone, but it's framed like something simple and obvious to do, when I believe it's often very complicated, by nature of each person having their own subjective perspective on objective reality. There's no angel descending from the heavens with a golden scroll containing the correct take on the issue. People come to the table in order to figure out what is true, not to just stamp the a priori known best opinion. Even if you had the most logically correct thought in the history of mankind, you couldn't take it and directly put it into someone else's mind. Instead, you express your idea in words, and the other person uses those words to reconstruct the original idea in their own mind. In that process, the original idea can easily be distorted or even lost. You might word it badly, you might get misheard, and the other person might interpret the words differently from what you intended. This is where additional context becomes helpful. It gives the other person more material to work with to understand you. To give an example with Playtime specifically, this character sucks to fight against sounds different coming from someone who just installed the game than from a veteran. Now, I concur that the number of hours alone is not a lot of context. But I believe the remedy is to give more information on top of it, not to shut up and say nothing because it doesn't matter. If you think that more context will always be needed and so Playtime by itself is worthless, consider that when giving the context it would be weird to specifically avoid Playtime as the one bad piece of information. In other words, Playtime matters but only with additional context is a different position than Playtime doesn't matter. The second reason I have for why context is valuable comes into play before the discussion even starts. Deeply examining an opinion and figuring out how true it is requires time and effort. Just like you are not required to examine in detail every opinion you come across, nobody is required to examine yours. Consider a monkey, through randomly hitting keys on a typewriter for eternity, wrote an exact copy of Hamlet. Imagine you're looking for someone to discuss writing screenplays with. The monkey is literally illiterate. Is it okay to skip talking with the monkey based on that context? You might say that this is not a fair anecdote, because unlike with illiterate monkeys, with humans you can often find a nugget of truth where you would least expect it. For another example then, imagine there are two people, but you only have time to engage with one of them. The first is known for his history of strawmanning, name-calling and character assassination. The second is known for being perfectly normal. Is it okay to consider this context when choosing who to talk to? And finally, I will borrow an anecdote from the original video. You can choose between someone who has never played a game but did the research and the average player of said game. Lucid's answer is like this.
If they know enough about how the game works and can convince me of that, they likely have a more unbiased perspective on the game's construction than the average person who actually plays the game. Therefore, their opinion might cause me to look at things differently than I would have if I had only talked to the people I know personally who play the game actively and enjoy it.
I posit that if the context was truly irrelevant, then it would be wrong to have a preference here. In a world saturated with information, it's perfectly normal, if not necessary, to have a filter on what you engage with. I openly admit that my time is limited, and I will use all available information to decide what to spend it on. I welcome others to do the same, and therefore consider it in my interest to show people why I'm worth listening to. The primary way to entice others to engage with you is to bribe them. I mean, to demonstrate trustworthiness and show respect towards them and towards the subject matter. In other words, show that you see value in your interlocutor and in the game being discussed. Being open about your perspective and biases by honestly sharing your context helps demonstrate trustworthiness. Being clear and concise shows that you value people's time. Being polite but direct shows that you consider your interlocutor intelligent. Representing the subject matter accurately and acknowledging the nuances involved shows that you are interested in truth-seeking and not a dunking session, etc. On the topic of respect, Lucid has a question for people that still disagree with him despite his excellent argumentation so far.
How many hours does someone have to have before you can respect their opinion?
Well, to answer, I don't have a strict playtime threshold for considering someone's opinion. However, if you rock up to a game I have enjoyed for 1,000 hours, and you have never even launched it, and then you demand massive changes because you have, quote, done your research, I will show you the door. Respect is about more than just how correct you are. If you haven't played the game but you looked into it, fair enough, I don't believe that should bar you from talking about it. Keep in mind though that the default assumption when you talk about any work of art is that you have engaged with it. Games being interactive only strengthens this assumption. If you fail to disclose this context, people will rightfully feel cheated when they find out. If you are an outsider, insisting that nobody needs to know who you are and that you should be treated the same as everyone that has been here for ages is quite literally acting entitled and will not earn you any sympathy. This is not arbitrary prejudice, it's important for preserving anything that a group of people considers valuable. In other words, if you don't believe literally everyone should have full access to mess with things you hold dear, some degree of gatekeeping is necessary. The people that see the value on the inside will understand why the gate is there, and will pay the toll and patiently wait for the gate to be opened. Those that just want to take it for themselves will instead complain about the gate being an arbitrary barrier of blockage in the way. To be fair though, gatekeeping can be excessive and drive away people that would contribute if let in. If someone with 10 hours complains that Counter-Strike's shooting is stupid because they can't hit anything, I think it's perfectly valid to tell them to learn more about the game and put some time into practicing. If the response was instead, skill issue, kill yourself, as funny as it may sound, the solution proposed doesn't exactly make it clear that you would like them to return after they improve. The approach I'm trying to advocate for is mutual respect. I'd like newcomers to respect the game they want to talk about and the people that have been enjoying it for a long time. I would also like veterans to keep an open mind and welcome those that would like to talk about the game despite not having that much experience. Dismissing someone's argument without showing any consideration to its contents is not conducive to a productive conversation. But even if we assumed it's never okay to dismiss anyone, which I think is wrong, this still wouldn't be an argument for Playtime providing no meaningful information. If you get arbitrarily dismissed, and your puny hours are used as the excuse, the problem is the dismissive attitude, not the metric it is hiding behind. So far I've argued that sharing the context around your perspective, including Playtime, can entice others to hear you out and help them understand what you mean. To complete the picture, I believe that putting time into gaining direct experience benefits your thinking regardless of whether you publicize your hours or not. I consider interactivity to be the key factor that distinguishes games from movies, comics, books, and other media. The less meaningful difference between playing yourself and watching someone else play, the more hesitant I am to call that work a game. For instance, a visual novel with no gameplay and a linear story is effectively a less convenient comic book, and plenty of walking simulators are effectively just less convenient animated movies. The point I'm getting at is that when interactivity is key to what a particular game is, there is no replacement for interaction when forming an opinion about that game. Now, obviously, you can learn a lot about a game without logging a single minute of gameplay. Lucid brings up an example of someone critiquing a game's story without playing it. I watched so many Super Mario Maker 2 videos that I know a lot about its mechanics despite never owning a Switch. You can listen to a game's soundtrack without playing. Recordings are sufficient to analyze the graphics and even spot some gameplay issues, like for example hitboxes disjointed from the visible models. You could also collect and analyze statistics to judge which characters, items or strategies work the best, all without stepping your foot into the game. What you cannot do is experience the gameplay without playing the game. I bring this up in relation to the point I already played, where Lucid presents a dichotomy between someone who never played a game, but did the research, and the average player of said game.
This is why I'm willing to listen to someone's opinion on a game, even if they've never played it, as long as they've done their research on it. If they know enough about how the game works, and can convince me of that, they likely have a more unbiased perspective on the game's construction than the average person who actually plays the game. Therefore, their opinion might cause me to look at things differently than I would have if I had only talked to the people I know personally who play the game actively and enjoy it.
While I understand the sentiment, I strongly dislike the implication that it's one or the other. A big part of learning is training your subconscious and developing muscle memory. A skilled carpenter might not be able to describe the exact precise purpose of every move he does. That doesn't mean he has no valuable knowledge, and it sure doesn't mean anyone could replicate what he does by just doing the research. Even the most abstract subjects like mathematics have students practice solving problems to internalize the knowledge. If you only read textbooks and never do any math, your knowledge will remain surface level. You might identify an integral, but you won't be able to solve it, much less understand the integral as a tool, and even less how you can creatively utilize that tool beyond solving textbook problems. Additionally, the sources you choose to trust might be inaccurate or have baked-in biases. Just because something sounds right or is a popular take doesn't mean it's true, and it's much harder to notice falsehoods if you've not spent much time in the game. Now, I do not mean to dismiss theoretical knowledge. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to build any kind of solution without first getting a good understanding of the problem you're solving. Without available theory and with no guidance in learning, you would only ever know however much you could figure out from scratch within one lifetime. Many great inventions we take for granted today simply can't be achieved that way. I believe research and direct experience are complementary, and the best quality of thought can only be reached by combining both. Learning theory broadens your perspective and gives you more ideas to consider, while acting out what you learned grounds your perspective and gives you a more granular understanding of the nuances involved. So, going back to the topic, I think the more interactive the game, the more important it is to experience the gameplay to form an opinion about it. Another problem I have with this Chad outsider scholar versus virgin average player point is that the way it's presented makes it seem like emotional investment just permanently damages your perception, and thus you should avoid it. To be clear, I don't think that's what Lucid wanted to say, but the framing is quite unfortunate. I think it's easy to see how emotional investment can skew your perspective. If you really enjoy a game, you will be inclined to oppose changes, and if your experience is miserable, you will probably prefer the game be modified. What might be less noticeable is that a lack of attachment might be its own source of bias. If you have no stake in what's going on, you are more likely to be flippant about proposing changes. Indifference is also unlikely to motivate you to dig deeper. The point is that we are human, and prior experiences, culture, the languages we use, even the mood we are in at the time, all influence our perception. We lack direct access to the objective perspective. This doesn't mean it's impossible to judge things objectively, but the way to do that is not to eliminate the human factor, but to stay conscious of it and take it into account when thinking. For example, when you really like a game, don't try to suppress that, but rather when someone proposes changes, exercise additional caution because you are more likely to oppose them by default. Conversely, when you are not emotionally invested, don't try to evoke feelings where you have none, but tread carefully, as it will be easier for you to stomp on something important without realizing. Okay, at the very start, I explained that the premise of Playtime being either the sole arbiter of correctness or entirely irrelevant is a false dichotomy. Afterwards, I showed that experience is valuable for forming your perspective, and that sharing additional context, including Playtime, can make people more likely to listen to you and understand what you mean. There's one more part of the original video left for me to tackle. The conclusion, which extrapolates the points made about Playtime into a statement about experience and credentials in general, which is a severe scope expansion, and so we will be leaving the cozy realm of video games. If you have an allergy to philosophy and/or abstraction, consider exiting the train at this station. Because, if you can't believe it, we're about to get even more autistic. I hope by the end of it you will be able to understand the frustration that propelled me to slowly chip away at this reply in the over a year since the original video released. Considering the ideas in the conclusion are fairly intertwined, I will play it in full and then respond to it as a whole.
Growing up, we're often taught that the older you are, the more experience you have. And this intangible experience makes the opinions of an adult more valuable inherently than the opinions of a child. This idea then later extends from age to education. If someone has a degree, then their opinion is generally seen as more valuable than that of someone who's uneducated. In real life, this is often fine. Of course, you should probably trust the trained medical professional with 10 years of accredited experience versus your next door neighbor who insists that 10 gallons of pineapple juice will cure your emphysema. In situations where action needs to be taken, it's best to trust the person with more experience. However, when it comes to debates or arguments, situations where nothing is really at stake, a person's credentials aren't at all relevant to the discussion being had. They may be the reason for why someone believes something, but they should never be used as evidence that a person is correct. A person's opinion should be judged on the merits of their argument. Nothing else matters aside from that. And yet, all too often, a person will cite their experience as a reason for why their opinion is the more correct one, whether it be on social media or in YouTube videos. It's a parlor trick, a cheap way to fool people into automatically accepting whatever is said because the person who said it has the magical trait of experience. All too often, people get platforms and an audience just by having the right credentials and being in the right place at the right time, but we should all work to evaluate what we're told before we believe it to be true. That way we don't end up thinking that Jigglypuff is Melee's best character or that random crits exist in TF2's competitive mode. If we learn to judge the information we're told, both as a society and as individuals. Thank you for watching.
As with plenty of points in this video, I think a lot of the sentiments expressed are agreeable. The idea that you should think critically and judge information for yourself is not only sound, but almost self-evident. Appealing to your own authority through claimed experience or credentials in place of arguments is generally wrong, though this one is more debatable, especially since Lucid brings up the opinions of adults versus the opinions of children.
Growing up, we're often taught that the older you are, the more experience you have. And this intangible experience makes the opinions of an adult more valuable inherently than the opinions of a child.
A naive, narrow outlook is often called childish. This is because children's brains aren't developed enough to comprehend complex issues, and they did not yet encounter, much less solve, enough problems to make broadly reliable judgments. They are missing a huge chunk of perspective that you can only gain through being responsible for yourself. Children are also not exactly known for their stellar understanding of long-term consequences. This obviously doesn't mean children can never be correct where adults are wrong, but it is an extremely good reason to generally value the opinions of adults higher than those of children, and it's also why children should listen to their parents. There are plenty of cases where something is good for the child, but he or she is too young to understand why, and it would be downright irresponsible for the parents to avoid that thing just because the child thinks it's bad. Naturally, as children develop into teenagers and then enter adulthood, they should be taking on more responsibilities and through that gaining experience, understanding and perspective. Respect for the child's independence and views should increase as this happens. Parents should shift from controlling and guarding their child to an advisory role, culminating in the child taking full responsibility for their own life. None of this is, as Lucid later calls experience, magical, and frankly, I find the implication that it's arbitrary prejudice to differentiate children from adults preposterous. If you do not agree, do you support age gates on sex, drinking, smoking, driving, voting, holding office, signing up for the military, etc.? Do you have an argument for those that doesn't bring up inherent differences between adults and children? Let's continue to the next point.
This idea then later extends from age to education. If someone has a degree, then their opinion is generally seen as more valuable than that of someone who's uneducated.
This point has an asterisk.
Of course, you should probably trust the trained medical professional with 10 years of accredited experience versus your next-door neighbor who insists that 10 gallons of pineapple juice will cure your emphysema. In situations where action needs to be taken, it's best to trust the person with more experience. However, when it comes to debates or arguments, situations where nothing is really at stake, a person's credentials aren't at all relevant to the discussion being had. They may be the reason for why someone believes something, but they should never be used as evidence that a person is correct.
I think this, quote, where action needs to be taken, conditional, shows that even Lucid doesn't fully believe that experience and credentials don't matter. As an example, he mentions that if you have an illness, you should probably trust the accredited and experienced doctor over your neighbor's pineapple juice treatment. Let's take this scenario and remove the illness from you so that the conversation is hypothetical and no action is necessary. If your neighbor managed to convince you, in an entirely theoretical discussion, that drinking pineapple juice is better than going to the doctor, there will be very real consequences if you or someone close to you contracts the illness. For this reason, I don't think that just because the situation is theoretical, the doctor's credentials and experience flip from crucial to entirely irrelevant. Hypothetical discussions don't take place in a vacuum. If you change someone's mind, the actions they choose to take as a result will have an impact on reality. If there's literally zero effect in reality, the conversation by definition does not matter, and neither does the information shared within, but it's wrong to extrapolate this to all theoretical discussions. You could say that the doctor will have way better arguments because of his knowledge and practice, and so he will easily win against the pineapple juice enthusiast on the merits, without having to rely on his credentials. This is easy to think with an example this ridiculous, but even seemingly absurd alternative treatments still convince some people, and choices in reality are often much less clear-cut. Replace pineapple juice with a treatment that sounds more plausible. Have the neighbor argue for it with scientific-sounding language, give him legitimate-looking research papers on its effectiveness. Will you really be able to simply evaluate the opinions on their merits if you are not knowledgeable about the subject matter? Yes, you could do research and learn more, but how much time, money and resources can you sink into figuring out who's right? Even if you perhaps could solve this one, how many more problems of this caliber until it simply becomes impossible to investigate in sufficient depth? The attitude that only the contents of the opinion matter works where it's possible to determine whether the opinion is true or false in a reasonable amount of time and at a reasonable cost. People value experience, credentials, and other signifiers because they often face problems that don't have clear solutions, but they still need to be addressed somehow. I'm quite a fan of division of labor, because I can focus on what I'm good at and rely on other people for things I'm not interested in. This cooperation, however, requires trust, which is difficult and expensive to build. You can usually establish trust with your closest circle of friends and business partners, but the systems you rely on for water, food, energy, security, waste disposal, and countless other things depend on far more people than you could reasonably meet, much less personally assure the trustworthiness of. Part of this problem resolves naturally through trust networks, where some of the trust you have in your friends extends to the people they recommend to you. Another part is addressed by institutions dedicated to teaching people and verifying their knowledge and abilities, like universities. If you trust a university, a diploma from that university effectively means we taught and tested this guy, he's trustworthy. On top of credentials, there are other mechanisms that serve to keep people trustworthy over time. To continue with the doctor versus neighbor example, not only has the doctor gone through education, including mandatory practice, and passed several exams, but he can have his license revoked for malpractice, and he might lose his reputation if too many of his patients have bad experiences and the information spreads. Your neighbor, by comparison, is not kept in check by any of that. Of course, doctors aren't infallible. No institution is perfect, and no certificate is a 100% guarantee. even if the best ones do come close. Some untrustworthy people will always slip through, and no matter how robust the rules to keep an organization reliable become, they won't have any effect if people fail to uphold them, and so corruption will always remain a factor. However, imperfections don't make a system useless, and people's needs don't disappear when a system fails to fulfill them. If universities become corrupted and diplomas become worthless, other organizations will start taking their place. One such way is private certification institutions, which is already fairly common in the tech sector, Cisco certificates for instance, and I'm sure you can find examples in other sectors too. The need for outsourcing teaching, training, and verification to dedicated organizations will persist because it is incredibly expensive for everyone to do it on their own. People will also rely more on other ways to approximate trustworthiness. Even if a diploma doesn't indicate knowledge or skill anymore, it still demonstrates that you, at the very least, over the course of a few years managed to show up to classes and put enough effort into exams to graduate. Similarly, when you answer a seemingly random question at a job interview, you communicate far more than just the words you say. How quickly you are able to answer, how annoyed you get at the question seeming unrelated, whether you hint at the absurdity of the question in your answer, it is all information that can be used to estimate your character and decide whether you can be trusted with the work your potential employer needs done. This is of course not to say that there are no dumb recruiters that ask dumb questions because they are dumb, but hiring is a big risk for small to medium businesses, and even skilled and certified people are not guaranteed to be the right choice for any particular position. I believe that when people put their resources on the line, as is the case with hiring, they shouldn't be prevented from picking who to work with based on whatever information they want. Okay, so far I've mostly talked about the upsides of considering credentials and experience when determining trustworthiness, to show that I believe dropping them completely, as Lucid advocates for, is foolish. Granted, he did concede that they are only worthless in theoretical discussions where nothing is at stake, but I posit that the distinction he made between theoretical and practical discussions is flimsy, and as explained with Playtime, additional context remains valuable even in low-impact scenarios. Now, to avoid coming across like diploma enjoyer, there are obvious issues arising from over-reliance on credentials. As previously mentioned, institutions become corrupted and people slip through the cracks, so taking a diploma as a guarantee of perfection is a recipe for disaster. On top of that, automatically dismissing everyone without a diploma can easily lead to missing out on valuable insight. The underlying issue in both cases is treating these systems as gospel instead of the tools they are. The information they provide is of value, but there should be a layer of separation between what the systems tell you and the trust you actually place in a particular person. Abstraction, while incredibly valuable when used well, carries an inherent risk of detachment from reality. I believe there are no universal institutions or perfect rules for determining what is true, who to trust, and what information is relevant. It's up to your judgment. Figure out what your goals are, and then use all information available to choose what to do with the time and resources you have. Having goals will help you focus on what's most important and reorient yourself if you ever get lost in the moment. If someone brings up their playtime for no reason, it might be better to ignore it than highlight it and risk derailing the conversation. Maybe sharing your hours will help to demonstrate that the opinion you have is not just what 10-hour noobs think. Perhaps the people dismissing you for being too employed are not worth engaging with in the first place. The call is yours to make. If I may, however, I suggest that a good approach to picking who to talk to and which information to consider should be more nuanced than always or never. Real issues are rarely that simple. I'd like to close with the Chesterton's fence anecdote. If you see an old fence going across a road, and you think it's pointless and should be removed, first sit down and think of the reason it was put there in the first place. Only after you know that reason, you may continue to remove the fence. Otherwise, you risk interfering with or straight up breaking things without ever realizing how important they were. Considering opinions on their merits is the base idea we as humans started from. Mechanisms like respecting your elders, age gates, mandatory practice hours, credentials, schools, and many others emerged and stood the test of time because they allow people to approximate the merits of many different ideas on a societal scale. They are not magical, they are not arbitrary, and they shouldn't be dismissed just because your parents made mistakes or you found a stupid professor. That's it. Cheers.